Hello, everyone. I'm Erica Lukes. This is Expanding Frontiers Research. You can go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to check out the work that we do. I want to give my partner, my research partner, and somebody who has been very instrumental in investigating things with me that have really, to my surprise and chagrin, gained attention. We were recently awarded an award from the Utah Investigative Journalist for work on Phenomicon. I want to thank Jack Brewer for always being there and working hard behind the scenes to do records requests and to do good investigative work. You can always, and I would definitely recommend, getting The Grays Have Been Framed or Wayward Sons. Both of those books Jack Brewer wrote, and they are excellent. And now with more information coming out on some of the things that are taking place with the DOJ and Russian interference into our elections, in my opinion, it makes Jack's work over the years all the more important. So definitely check them out. Tonight, this afternoon, whatever. I'm usually used to broadcasting in the evening, but I'm going to bring in my guest who I have been dying to talk to for quite some time, because I understand how important his work has been over the years. I am joined by Rick Allen Ross, who's a private consultant and a cult intervention specialist. He has worked as an anti-cult activist and community organizer. He began the work in 1982, which we're going to hear a little bit more about, but he has consulted the FBI. He has consulted various law enforcement agencies. He has also had time where he had to be under protection from different threats that he was facing from some of the work that he did. He has been on many TV shows over the years. In fact, Rick, just tell us the TV shows that you've been. I've seen you on Dr. Phil.
Yeah, I've been on Dr. Phil, I think 6 times.
Wow.
I joined Oprah a couple times. Donahue, who passed away recently, back in the day, I was on his show 3 times. And I've been on 48 Hours, the Today Show, Good Morning America. I've appeared in about 30 documentaries, including some may have watched The Vow about the cult NXIVM, or Seduced, which also was about NXIVM. And so I've been very active in the media going all the way back to the 80s, and continue to do programs, news programs, as recently as just a few weeks ago, and I continue to do that.
And, I've seen your face for many, many years on all of those programs, maybe not all of them, but most of them. And it's been interesting to watch you as a person change. And you were mentioning before we went on the air how your work in finding out and how to reach out to people has changed with the internet. And also, if you could just kind of describe a little bit about, before we get to that, because I want to dig into that, how things have changed. Can you just tell us about why you got involved with this?
Well, Erica, it started because my grandmother's nursing home was covertly infiltrated, that is the paid professional staff, by a group that was targeting the elderly. And when I found out about them, because my grandmother was approached by one of them, that attempted to recruit her, and I found out about it. So I became very concerned about what was going on in the nursing home and how it was affecting my grandmother's life. And that made me an activist in my community, which at that time was Phoenix, Arizona. And so I worked on a number of committees to raise awareness about what was going on, and in particular, that if someone wanted to share what they believed with the elderly people at the nursing home, that was fine, but that they should do that because they were requested, and that there was they had gone through proper channels, not covertly by joining the staff with the purpose of approaching people that had not asked to meet with them. So I think that it began for me as a personal thing, and then it evolved, and I worked for a social service agency in Phoenix, and then later became a private consultant that did interventions to get people out of cults. And to date, I've done over 500 interventions across the United States and around the world. And worked with people from all walks of life, all ages, all socioeconomic backgrounds, in an effort to help them understand the group that recruited them more in depth and why their family is really worried about them.
You must have seen so many things and had so many dark experiences. How do you process? How do you to do your own self-care to make sure that you're not taking some of these things on personally?
Well, I try to take a vacation.
Those are good.
This summer, I went down to Mexico and spent quite a bit of time in Guadalajara, which is one of my favorite cities in the world. And I think it's important to relax and take a break and reflect. And also, the families that I work with are very inspiring. They care about their family members, they love them, they want to help them. And I think knowing that you're fighting the good fight, and that quite frequently I'm up against groups that have been called evil, have been called cults. Keith Raniere, who headed Nexium, was, in my opinion, a psychopath, a malignant narcissist who really, truly hated women and tortured women and exploited them. Some of your listeners and viewers may know that there were 150 women, I think, that he physically tortured through this process where he branded them with a cauterizing iron in their flesh. He didn't do it personally. He had a doctor that was his follower do it. She later lost her license to practice medicine, but she did this, and this was his way of identifying his sexual slaves. And these women didn't start out wanting to be anything like that or participate in anything like that. But over a period of time, in many cases years, bit by bit, layer by layer, he pulled them in and exploited them horribly. So when you're fighting against somebody like that, and I fought against Keith Raniere for over 14 years until he was arrested. He sued me. He harassed me. He had me stalked by private investigators. He literally bought my garbage and even tried to set me up on a phony intervention case to get me out on a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean. Now, that was canceled at one point, but my lawyers felt that they intended to kill me. So when you go head to head with somebody like Keith Raniere, who's now serving life in prison, you feel like you're fighting the good fight. And the families you meet are often, very good people, very brave people who want to help their adult child, their spouse, or in some cases their parents. And so I think that makes it good. It makes it worthwhile.
And that has to be absolutely rewarding to meet people like you say that are just good people, and to see how many ways you can help a human being overcome something that seems like insurmountable sometimes. I can't imagine. And so I've got to ask you, after you started working, you decided that this was a passion for you. What were some of the first cases that you were involved with?
I was involved in cases that affected the Jewish community because my background is Jewish. My grandmother was Jewish. The social service agency I worked for was Jewish Family and Children's Service of Phoenix. And so I really was working with Jewish families and groups that either targeted Jews or involved Jews. So I was dealing with one group called Jews for Jesus that claimed that Jews could only be fulfilled by converting to fundamentalist Christianity. And that was their belief system. And so the Jewish community responded. I mean, we felt that it was not good that an organization targeted just Jews. And we question the propriety of that, and also the deceptiveness of calling themselves Jews for Jesus when in fact they were really fundamentalist Christians, some of whom had a Jewish background, but none of whom currently believed in Judaism. So we found common cause with many other denominations in Arizona, and there were people from all faiths that gathered together, and we did an educational brochure called "What in God's Name is Going On in Arizona?" And we educated the community about groups that we felt violated ethical guidelines. For example, trying to recruit children without parental notification or consent, cruising around hospitals looking for vulnerable people without families requesting their presence, or targeting a particular faith group like Jews for Jesus did, and doing so deceptively. That was our consensus. And so I think that my first cases were tangential to that work. But then later, when I left Jewish Family and Children's Service and became a private consultant, I work with families across all religious backgrounds, predominantly because most of the United States is Christian. Most of the families that I work with were either Protestant, Catholic, or that there were families that I worked for that were Mormons. I can remember working for Mormon families that had lost a loved one to a polygamous group that had recruited them, and they were concerned about their welfare. For example, there was a group called the True and Living Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, led by this man named Harmston, that was near Manti, Utah. And this was a polygamous cult. Harmston claimed that he was the reincarnation of Joseph Smith. And the people in the group literally worshiped him and would do whatever he said. And I worked for a Mormon father of, I think he had at least 6 children. And he was concerned when his wife became involved. They went through a divorce, and he was concerned that his children would be taken into this compound by Manti, and that his little girls would be raised as polygamist wives. Because many times these children will be married at a very young age. So I found myself working for many different people, most of whom were outside of the Jewish community, as I traveled first across the United States and later around the world, doing these interventions.
And so I've got to ask you, with regard to the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, as they like to be called now, do you view the church in general as a type of a cult? And how do you define a cult versus a religion?
Well, let me first define the word, the understanding of what is a destructive cult. A destructive cult has 3 core characteristics that in my book, Cults Inside Out, I refer to as the nucleus for the definition of a destructive cult. And I devoted an entire chapter to this. So what you see are 3 core characteristics. Number 1, an absolute dictatorial leader who is totalitarian, who has no meaningful accountability, who is the defining element and driving force of the group, and who becomes an object of worship. Whatever that leader says is right, whatever that leader says is wrong, is wrong. And then second, that leader uses techniques of coercive persuasion, thought reform, what we commonly call brainwashing, to break people down, change them, and get them into a place of total submission, where they become essentially puppets, pawns, used by the leader. And the leader mandates these techniques to be used on his or her followers. And that ends up with the leader having undue influence over his or her followers. And then finally, the leader uses undue influence to exploit and do harm to the people in the organization. So they are either exploited financially, they may be exploited sexually, they may provide free labor to the leader, which he makes money from, or it may cross over into criminal behavior. For example, Warren Jeffs, the leader of the FLDS polygamous cult, who is now in prison in Texas. He was raping children. And so that would be, of course, a most extreme example of abuse. Or someone like Paul Mackenzie, who is now on trial in Kenya for mass murder. He is responsible for encouraging his members to fast and pray and literally starve to death. Over 400 bodies were recovered from his compound in Kenya, and he's now standing trial. Many of the deceased were children. And so you look for those three core characteristics: the absolute totalitarian leader, the use of thought reform and coercive persuasion to gain undue influence, and the destructive nature of the group, which varies from group to group. Some groups may be much worse than others. And then when you identify those three core characteristics, it doesn't matter what the group believes. It could be politics, theology, therapy, exercise, meditation. That merely is a mask or a facade. It's not what the group believes, it's how they behave. And so finally, to answer your question on point, Erica, about the LDS, and I hope people will not get too upset, but I would say this. I would say, is the Mormon Church a cult today? I would say no, they are not, because they have a system of governance. They have the first council of the presidency, first quorum of the 70, second quorum of the 70, and there are elections to establish these levels of government that the Mormon Church has. So, but in its earliest beginnings, under Joseph Smith and subsequently under Brigham Young, in my opinion, yes, the Mormon Church could be seen as a personality cult, because it was based and defined by the claims of Joseph Smith, and subsequently he ruled over the LDS Church. I mean, when they were in Nauvoo, he was the president, he was the prophet, he was the head of the militia. He controlled the bank in Nauvoo. He controlled everything. And subsequently, when Brigham Young said, we're going to go to the promised land, and Utah became that promised land, Zion, he was also an absolute authoritarian leader. But subsequent to the death of Brigham Young, power began to devolve, and the Mormon Church has evolved ever since and changed, because as you may know, the Mormon Church president can receive new light, and things change. For example, in 1890, when President Woodruff declared polygamy no longer a practice of the Mormon Church in what was called the Woodruff Manifesto. That was a big change. And the Mormon Church continues to evolve and change. So I would say that it's an example of a group that might be considered in its earliest beginnings, its origin, as a personality-driven, cult-like organization, in my opinion. But it's an example of how groups can change. Okay. And I think Jehovah's Witnesses would be another example, though today I would regard them as a destructive authoritarian organization. And I would say Seventh-day Adventists also began in that way. But I would say today they have evolved completely into a democratically governed mainstream religious denomination. But in their earliest beginnings, they followed a man named Miller, and they were called the Millerites. And then subsequently, they followed a woman, Ellen White, who created things like their vegetarian diet and many of their healthy practices. And I think you could argue that the Adventists evolved into a very positive religious organization because their exercise regimen and diet allows them to live longer lives. one of the so-called blue zones where people live to be maybe 100 is in Loma Linda, California, which is a bastion of Seventh-day Adventism. So
Oh, that's
I think a group can evolve, and a group can evolve in a positive way.
that, you know what, thank you for clarifying that. I think that's really fascinating, and that makes a lot of sense to me with regard to the Mormon church, especially. It is fascinating. Thank you so much. I have a question in chat, and I want to just say that you are getting, Dr. Timothy Brigham is in chat, and he's just saying that you do such great work. And so I wanted to let you know, but what involvement have you had with Scientology?
Oh, unwanted and wanted. Scientology has harassed me quite a bit over the years. And, at one time I was a target of lead counsel, Kendrick Moxon, a lawyer for Scientology, in litigation, and it was quite protracted. But I've done interventions to get people out of Scientology. And one of the largest archives of information about Scientology historically is at culteducation.com, the Cult Education Institute, which since 1996 has been archiving online information about Scientology. So Scientology has harassed me over the years, and I've done interventions to get people out of Scientology. My book has a chapter on Scientology and also a chapter on an intervention to get someone out of Scientology. A man who I met after he had been in Scientology for 26 years. And the intervention was successful and he left. So I've dealt with quite a bit of Scientology, which is based on the writings of a man named L. Ron Hubbard, who died in 1986, and of course has celebrity members like Tom Cruise, John Travolta, Jenna Elfman, and at one time Priscilla Presley and her daughter Lisa Marie Presley were involved in Scientology. And you might know that Leah Remini, who
Right.
is probably its most famous ex-member and won an Emmy for her work on producing a television show called Scientology and the Aftermath for A&E, in which she brought former members to tell their stories about how Scientology hurt them.
What a brave woman. I mean, because that Scientology, you just hear absolute horror stories, which you can attest to, of what the lengths that they will go to intimidate, harass for years, people that try to leave.
Well,
And so,
Erica, yeah, I've had Scientology private investigators having me under surveillance and pursuing me. So I can tell you from firsthand experience that speaking out about Scientology can be hazardous to your health, so to speak.
so how did you know that you were being followed? I mean, it seems to me from what I've watched, and perhaps in Leah's documentary, but that they were pretty obvious sometimes with their surveillance.
Well, one time I was doing an intervention in California to get a man out of a group called the Waco Davidians. They were the followers of David Koresh. Later, there would be a standoff with the FBI, and many Davidians died in a fire outside of Waco, Texas, at their compound. And David Koresh, their leader, would die. I was doing an intervention to get someone out of that group, which ended in success. He left the group and was not there as a result when the compound was in flames. But I was under surveillance, and I found out because a Scientology PI went to this young man's house and tried to persuade him to not meet with me any further in the intervention effort. He was staying with his brother near in the Los Angeles area. And so I knew that PI also later called David Koresh to tell him that I was deprogramming one of his loyal followers in California. And of course, this was a violent group. So having a PI tip off David Koresh that I was trying to get somebody out of his group and to turn against him as a follower and leave, I mean, that wasn't something that Koresh appreciated.
And so at what point in time were you you were protected by law enforcement?
Well, there was a cult leader in the Midwest. His name is Rama Bahara, though he has changed his name several times. And the FBI did a sting operation to find out what he was doing, what he was planning. He was at odds with the local community. I believe it was in Wisconsin, and so they, in the sting operation, he thought he was hiring a hitman to get rid of his enemies, and he had a list of enemies, about 50 people, and I was one of those people that was marked to be murdered. And so that was a major news story. CBS broke the story. And for many months, I think it was maybe more than a year, I received regular notification from the Justice Department that I was under protection regarding this threat against my life. At another point, when I would eventually give testimony to in court, in federal court, against Keith Raniere in his criminal trial, I was under the protection of the Department of Homeland Security.
Oh my gosh, that must have been very unnerving. But
yeah.
how did your the people around you? How did the people around you feel and adjust to that?
Well, I have been harassed and pursued by a number of cults over the years. I've been sued by groups called cults 5 times. All of those lawsuits ended in dismissal. Another lawsuit culminated in forcing me into bankruptcy, which was the one involving Scientology lawyer Kendrick Moxon. But it was later settled, and I was able to continue my work. But there have been times that my family, I can remember my mother before she died, around the time of Scientology bankrupting me, saying, is this really what you want to do with your life? Because this is this has been very harmful to you financially, and your life has been threatened. And of course, before I became involved in my work, I worked for a cousin of mine in the salvage yard business, which was completely different. And and did very well working for him. He was great. And so my mother really questioned, is this what you really want to do? You could do something else. And I told her, no, this is what I want to do. This is it. And I'm not going to give up. And so there have been times that family has been concerned, but I've been at it now for over 40 years.
That's incredible. And it's nice that they've been supportive, concerned about you, obviously, but then to have that support is I would imagine, very important for you, just to keep your balance and things. That is really frightening. So I've got to ask you this, what do you know about Jay-Z Knight?
Oh, well, Jay-Z Knight heads a group called the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. And that is predicated on her claim that she channels a 35,000-year-old dead spirit of a former general on the lost continent of Atlantis named Ramtha. And so she will go into a kind of, she claims, an altered state, and then she channels the spirit and speaks for this spirit. And based on those claims, she created a school to share the enlightenment of this being from Atlantis that she claims to be able to channel. And she's become a very wealthy woman. And, one person that followed her was Linda Evans, a famous actress who was best known for playing Crystal in the television series Dynasty. And her husband, I think they're now divorced, Yanni, was a musician, very well known. He was also involved. So Jay-Z Knight created a kind of community, a compound near Yelm, Washington, the state of Washington. And she has many, many followers and has become very, very wealthy through this Rantha School of Enlightenment. And I've received complaints about the school, complaints about Jay-Z Knight. In fact, there was a man that you may recall. He was in the Vow. His name is Mark Vicente. Mark was the videographer for Keith Raniere. And then his video filming was then in part the substance of The Vow, because the people that did the documentary The Vow for HBO were able to use Mark's work as a videographer, recording various things that happened in NXIVM and with Keith Raniere. Now, Mark would find out about the terrible treatment of women in NXIVM, and he would then leave the group. But before Mark was in NXIVM, he was in the Rantha School of Enlightenment, and he was Jay-Z Knight's videographer. And he actually produced a very well-known documentary called What the Bleep.
Yes.
That was Mark Vicente working with Jay-Z Knight. And she was featured in that documentary, What the Bleep. And so Mark called me, and I'll never forget that call. That would have been back around 2018, 2017. And he called me and he said, Rick, in NXIVM, you are Satan. You are considered the devil incarnate. And so when I realized how bad Keith Raniere is, through talking with these poor women that he abused, I thought, well, if Keith Raniere is really not this great benevolent leader, maybe this guy that they say is the devil he's been fighting with and litigating against for so many years, maybe he's not so bad. So the next thing I know, I get a call from Mark Vicente, and he at one point said to me, you know, Rick, I was in what I considered to be today a cult for years. I was a follower devoted to Jay-Z Knight. And then I got out of the group because I thought this group is a cult. It's personality driven. People worship Jay-Z Knight as some kind of enlightened being, or the person that is channeling this enlightened being. And whatever she says is right, whatever she says is wrong is wrong. And I needed to get away from that. And what did I do? I got into another cult. And arguably, I got into a worse one. So he said to me, what am I, Rick? Am I a cult hopper? Am I somebody that's going to keep going from group to group for the rest of my life? And I said, Mark, you need to stop, take a deep breath, take a pause, and unpack what has happened to you in your life. And what I would suggest is read my book, Cults Inside Out. Start with the historical chapters about modern cults, and go through the chapter on defining a destructive cult, cult brainwashing, etc., and draw the parallels, I think you can, between what you have been through and what these other people have been through, that the book reflects in the historical chapters, and then also what techniques were used on them that is reflected in the chapter on brainwashing, and how all of these groups share the same common core characteristics. And if you can get your head around that, and we can talk about it, you can call me whenever you want, and then maybe you can see what you need to watch for in the future. What are the warning signs? what would be the red flags. And so Mark ended up doing very well, got out of Nexium. He's helped a lot of other people get out of not only Nexium, but other groups through speaking out. And I'm not worried that he's going to get involved in another cult. I'm going to knock on wood.
Right, me too.
I think anybody can be tricked, but I think the best way to vaccinate yourself from cult, to prevent cult involvement, if you will, is to understand their techniques of recruitment and manipulation, and to understand what they share as characteristics in common.
That is such great advice, and I'm happy to hear that he's doing well. I've definitely heard of his name over the years, and I want to just say and tell you, we actually, with my nonprofit Expanding Frontiers, we have done quite a few records requests and have received a lot of information, a lot of videos, police reports about Ramtha and the JZ Knight compound, which has been fascinating. And so you can go to our website and look at all of that, because we try to get information like you have done on with your work since 1996 to make sure that that information is archived, digitally archived, and people have that available to them, because it's just, like you say, knowledge is power. Yeah. And understanding, we all have patterns in our lives, and some of us are more susceptible probably to falling into certain traps. And so I want to ask you, because I've heard you lecture and talking, let's talk about ways that you are first approached, how somebody deems you worthy of recruitment. And then, what are your vulnerabilities as a person? What do they look for? And then how do they begin that process of recruitment?
Well, a consistent narrative is someone is going through a bad patch in their life. And we all do. But some people going through a bad patch have additional bad luck by having someone they may know approach them at a particularly difficult time, and they seem to be offering help. And I would say that the person who is offering that help, saying, well, come to one of our seminars, come to this activity, come to our church for a healing service or whatever, that they sincerely believe that what they're offering is helpful because they themselves are caught up in the group. So they're sincere. And that person could be a coworker, a friend, a relative, a romantic interest, someone that you may trust who approaches you at a difficult time and says, I can help. And they don't disclose all the negative things about the group. There's so much that, in my experience, is being withheld in that initial recruitment process. And so, if you will, it's a kind of bait and switch con. Somebody goes for what they think is good and positive, as described, without understanding what's really behind the door, what is really in the group. Because when I talk to people that are deeply involved in a destructive cult, and we start to talk about what is destructive in the group and maybe the extreme sacrifices they have made and the people that have been hurt in the group, and I say, is that what you imagined would be the experience that you would have and the future you would have in this group? They will say, well, of course not. I never thought that. I didn't know that. And this was gradually what they came to understand after a long process of involvement and indoctrination. So what I'm saying is it could happen to anyone. All of us go through difficult periods. All of us have people we trust that might be involved potentially in a destructive group that could reach out to us at a pivotal point where we're very vulnerable and pull us in. And that is the story that I hear over and over and over again. And look, I have deprogrammed 5 medical doctors. One was an orthopedic surgeon, another was an anesthesiologist. And there isn't an Ivy League university, Yale, Harvard, Wharton, Cornell that I haven't deprogrammed a graduate of. So if you think you're too smart, if you think your family's too solid, if you think it could never happen to you, get over it. It could happen to you, and it could happen to someone you care about. So be aware, know that this can happen. And I'll add one more observation, which is social media, that people are being recruited online. They're being recruited. They're following people on X, formerly Twitter. They're going to Facebook pages. Uh, there are cults that are streaming, that are pulling people in through YouTube channels. So the way that people can be accessed is anybody with a smartphone, anybody with an electronic device that is connected online can be accessed, and then they can be bled out online through PayPal, Venmo, or what have you. So we now live at a time when cults can virtually reach us anywhere. And so recruitment is much easier than it otherwise was years ago when I started, before social media and before the internet.
And what were some of the, back in the olden days before the internet and things, I mean, where were the most common places? You mentioned like hospitals or things like that. Where were other places that people were recruited?
College campuses. That was back in the day, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the early 90s. And it still is a recruiting area. I get complaints every month about from college students who have been approached. But back before the social media and before the internet, groups called cults would send their recruiters to college campuses. And the main target group was 18 to 26. And this was a group of people that are young, that haven't really locked in what they believe, where they're going, and they're still open because that's part of growing up. And also, they may be away from home for the first time, living in the dorm, living in campus, off-campus housing, sharing an apartment with other college students. And so that would put these people in a vulnerable situation, in a strange new environment where they're looking for friends, looking for kind of, hey, I might pledge to this fraternity or sorority, or I want to be in this club so that I can meet new people and connect and network. And so cults would use that environment to target college students very successfully. There was one group that was particularly successful in the 80s and the 90s called the International Church of Christ, which was initially founded by a man by the name of Kip McKeon in the 70s in Massachusetts, with just a dozen followers, which at its peak in the late 90s had 250,000 members. And then various media outlets exposed the excesses and abuses of the group, the enrichment of certain leaders, and they began to diminish, and McKean lost his leadership role. But still today, I would estimate that they may have 25 to 50,000 active members. And so these groups would build on college campuses through college students. The ICC, as it became known, the McKean organization, in particular, virtually exclusively focused on college students.
I remember hearing you too when you were talking in an interview. You were mentioning that there were groups that were recruiting students or young kids that were out hiking. Did I hear that correctly?
I'm not, I don't recall that specifically, but there were groups when I began that I questioned that were not cults, but were very actively proselytizing, and they were targeting minor children. For example, there was a group called Child Evangelism Fellowship that was targeting elementary school children. They would set up booths at carnivals and fairs, and have people dressed as clowns or whatever, and try to bring kids in and preach to them. There was also a group that I received complaints about called Young Life, that targeted high school kids. And my question was not that they were cults, because I did not consider them and do not consider them to be cults. They don't have an all-powerful leader that they worship. And in fact, they are fundamentalist Christian organizations. But the idea that they would work with minor children, and in my experience, these kids, their parents did not know that the group was working with them. And I would get complaints from parents who were not fundamentalist Christians that said, well, who are these people to go and work with my kid? And in some situations, tell my kid, don't tell your parents, and work with my kids to make them over into a religion that I am not a part of, and that I did not approve of them doing this. And
Wow.
so what I would say to Young Life, and this was in my early career, I would say to some of the leaders of Young Life and Child Evangelism Fellowship, what you're doing would be okay if you have a parental notification and consent process. So you should tell the parents that you're working with their minor child. You can actually send them a form letter with a form to fill out, acknowledging that they know what your goals are, what your mission statement is, and they approve. And they think it's great that their kid is working with you. And they told me, oh, we don't have time for that. And I said, well, if you don't have time for that, then you don't have time to work with minor children that their parents don't know what you're doing. So I think that historically there have been groups that have targeted kids. But most of the groups that we call cults have targeted adults, 18 or older, because they realize the impediment of parental notification and consent, and the problems that they might have with parents if parents found out that they were working with their children. Though I might add to that and say that I have done many interventions with minor children working for their parents when they were involved in groups that their parents did not approve of.
Interesting. And thank you very much. I think from my recollection, when I was watching something about like places where people would be recruited, and there was a specific group that was targeting people that were in like specific areas in national parks that were kind of young, earthy, kind of the same age range, and they were targeting people. And I'll have to try to go back and remember where I heard that, but it was just fascinating. Or you've got airports that were great recruiting grounds. I mean, just all sorts of places like that where you just don't necessarily think that would happen. And it's very interesting. I want to just take a second and read what Jason Parker just posted. He said, Jews for Jesus targets our homeless service center in Palm Springs every week. They bring snacks and you must pray with them first. So.
Well, at least they're being out in the open and they're not operating surreptitiously. I mean, the group that I dealt with at my grandmother's nursing home that group is like Jews for Jesus, but it's another organization it was called Jewish Voice Broadcast. And they were not upfront about who they were and what they were doing. We're having people from their organization seek to be employed at a Jewish nursing home for the purpose of covertly approaching residents of the nursing home. So I don't have a problem with people sharing their faith. That can be a beautiful thing, but do it in an open and honest way with transparency. Come to the nursing home and say, look, I want to do a Bible study. I belong to the Evangelical Free Church, the Church of the Nazarene. I'm a Baptist, and I would like to share my faith with people that are interested. Would you post a bulletin on your bulletin board about my schedule and the fact that I'm available for Bible study. That there's nothing wrong with that. But if you do it covertly, if you do it in an underhanded, in my opinion, unethical way, that's a problem.
Thank you for that clarification. That's really good. And Amy, I've just got great people that post in chat that know a lot, but she said the Krishnas and the Moonies like airports as recruiting grounds. Does that take place as much anymore?
Yeah, there was litigation, Erica. There was an effort on the part of Los Angeles to have the Krishna consciousness people, that's the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, not to be confused with mainstream Hindus, who are not a problem, but they would be hawking, selling their books in LAX. I think they eventually lost and they had to leave LAX. The Unification Church, often called the Moonies, because they followed a self-proclaimed Messiah named Reverend Moon, son Mung Moon, who's now deceased, but his family, his children still run the Unification Church, which is worth a great deal of money and continues to be quite controversial. They would do fundraising. They would sell flowers. And at times they would lie to people. They would say, oh, I'm a Christian missionary, or they would even feign being disabled. They'd be in a wheelchair and they'd say, can you help me? So be aware that when people are soliciting cash donations in a public space, that they may be not what you think. And don't give money to somebody that you really aren't sure what they're all about and what they're going to do with that money. Because there are many, many cult groups that will send their people out to do fundraising or solicitation for contributions. And you may be supporting an organization that's really quite destructive and harmful. And you're not really helping the people you think you are.
Okay, thank you for that advice. Yeah, there's so much to watch out for. I wanted to go back a little bit, with regard to when you're getting indoctrinated into a cult. I know that you've mentioned like love bombing, you've mentioned mirroring, and some of these techniques that help people to feel more comfortable. Can you go into that a little bit more and give us information on some of those things to look for?
Well, love bombing is a descriptive, kind of catchphrase to describe seemingly unconditional love that is used by a group to lull you into a feeling of, well, these people really care about me, they like me, they even love me. So how can I be suspicious of them? I should return, I should reciprocate their caring and loving with my own respect and caring of them. And so groups will shower you with attention, with affection as a ploy to recruit you. And so the question is that love really unconditional, or aren't there strings attached? If you question what they believe and you question what they're doing, are they open and transparent about what's going on, or do they become increasingly kind of agitated and negative with you if you persist in asking questions that they really don't want to answer? So what you begin to realize is this is not unconditional love. This is highly conditional love, predicated on my willingness to accept whatever they tell me, go along with them, and serve the organization. And so, you really have to understand that when you get into a group and there's a resistance to questions or constructive criticism, or you see that the focus is on the leader and how much everyone is devoted to this leader, and all they do is praise the leader and agree with the leader, and anyone who questions that is made to feel that they're doing something sinful, they're doing something wrong, and they're being shunned, Or if you feel like you're in this group and there's no legitimate reason to leave, and that everyone who considers leaving or doing something else with their life is vilified, stigmatized, and you begin to pick up on that people that have left the group are no longer welcome. So I would say that reveals a group that can be very seen as very controlling, very manipulative, authoritarian, and very likely a destructive cult.
I just, you say those things, and I can think of several examples that I've run into of that same type of thing, and that recruitment does take place online. And that is, it's just to watch the people that try to break away from these things, and to watch the online intimidation and bullying that takes place. It's just right out there in the open. How closely does law enforcement monitor things like this, and when does that become something that would be on their radar?
Well, the group needs to cross the line. They need to cross the line in regards to the law. So are they not just bullying people psychologically and emotionally and verbally? Are they physically, uh, uh, punishing people? There are groups that literally beat people up. There are groups that have beaten children or adult members to death. Does the group deny medical care for children? There's a group right now in Australia called the Saints that is on trial for murder because they knowingly withheld insulin from a little girl that was diabetic, that needed insulin to live, and she died a painful death. And now the people are being prosecuted for murder because they willfully did that. Knowingly, they withheld her medication. Her parents are included in those that are on trial for murder. So has the group crossed the line criminally? Are they engaged in financial fraud? Have they taken advantage of people in a fraudulent scheme where they've extorted money from people? Are they violating labor laws? Are people working for the group in a way that would violate established laws regarding labor? So what authorities look for is, don't tell me that the group is maybe causing emotional distress or mental fatigue or certain things, but have they actually violated a law that's on the books? And if they have, they can be prosecuted. So Warren Jeffs was not prosecuted as the leader of the FLDS because he believed that he was a prophet, or that he believed that his group alone had the truth and that he was the true prophet and no one else was, or that he had many wives and he was a polygamist. He was prosecuted for raping children. He was prosecuted for sexual abuse of minor children. And so, has the leader crossed the line? Has the group crossed the line? For example, some of these polygamous groups will move underage girls from one location to another, and that has been prosecuted as sexual trafficking, and moving them for the purpose of them being these plural wives at the age of 12, 13, 14. So that is against the law. So if the group is violating a law, that can be something that authorities can be involved in.
And who would you go to if you were going to report that a crime had committed?
Well, it would depend. If you felt that they were violating Internal Revenue Service tax laws as a for example, a nonprofit charity, that they were laundering money that was donated to their organization to the leaders who were living the good life with money that was contributed and not taxed, that was flowing through the nonprofit 501c3 corporation, you would go to the Internal Revenue Service. If you felt that they were violating federal law, because they were trafficking members either for labor or sex from one state to another. You would go to the FBI. If you felt that they were violating immigration law by bringing members in from other countries and having them engage in, uh, basically uh, marriages for the purposes of getting a green card and getting residency, then you would go to INS. In many cases, you're going to local police because in that jurisdiction, if they're hurting people, if they're hurting children, you would go to Child Protective Services, and you would say, I believe, based on the bruises and contusions that I've seen on various children in this group, that they're physically abusing children. And of course, there are people that are mandated reporters. For example, a school teacher at a public school who sees that a child is being mistreated may report it, or a doctor or a nurse who, in examining a child, finds out that they've been sexually abused. They are mandated reporters, and they would report to the proper authorities.
And thank you so much. I think these are good things to know because sometimes people don't understand the resources or the places that they can go to seek help, and that there are specific, aside from local law enforcement, there are other areas to go if it meets a certain criteria. So thank you very much for pointing that out. With regard to 501c3s that are using their nonprofit to launder money, how does something like that work? Because I've definitely seen that there are 501c3s that in Utah particularly that are claiming to help child sex trafficking and that are actually using that money for their own gain. And so what does that look like? And what do we look for financially?
Well, Erica, it's tricky. I mean, for example, there are exemptions like Kenneth Copeland, who is a very well-known evangelist who has a 501c3 religious nonprofit, his ministry, Kenneth Copeland Ministries. He has a incredible mansion in Texas that he doesn't pay property taxes on, my understanding, and that is paid for and funded by the nonprofit because it's declared as what's called a parsonage. He also has jets that he, plural, that he flies around on, Gulf Streams. And these are paid for by his 501c3 nonprofit as an expense of his ministry. So there may be loopholes in the tax laws. There are quite a few, I think, that can be used by a leader of a particular group to avoid paying taxes and live a fairly lavish life. But if you see that they are taking money and you suspect that they are moving money through the nonprofit to buy property that they own solely, and that is under their name or their child's name or their spouse's name, and you suspect that they are in fact taking money, converting it from money flowing through the nonprofit to personally held assets under their own name or through an LLC or a corporation that they completely control, then you might want to blow the whistle on them. But don't be surprised if the IRS isn't jumping to investigate, because the IRS is understaffed and overworked, and they may feel that it's not worth it for them to take the time to really dig into that. And that's my experience on occasion.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. And I can think of a couple other instances that have different groups that have had key leaders that have a lot of money has gone into that nonprofit. And over the years, they've had different chapters yeah, I mean, there's lots of questions that I've got going on in my mind now. So thank you for clarifying that. I want to go a little bit off that topic and talk about this satanic ritualistic abuse, and what are your thoughts on that? Because that has certainly we saw the big heyday of that a decade ago, and what has become of that, and is that something? What credence do you give that?
Very little, if any, credence.
Great.
I never bought into those conspiracy theories. I always said, well, where is the physical evidence? So they would say that all these babies were being bred for sacrifice, and that they were being murdered and everything. And again, authorities would say, where are the remains? Where are the bone fragments? Where is the residue of these crimes? And they were unable to produce physical evidence. And the FBI and many law enforcement entities across the US investigated these claims and found them to be false. And what was terrible was there were people that were falsely accused who suffered greatly. Some were sent to prison and later exonerated, and there were no crimes committed. And the idea that there was this vast network of satanic abusers and killers was a fantasy. It was all based on anecdotal evidence that was never substantiated with objective physical evidence. Right now, there's a man in Indiana who confessed to killing two girls. And his lawyers tried to mount as a defense that there was this ominous Odinist group that actually killed the girls. But they had no evidence. And the judge in that case ruled that they may not mention this conspiracy theory in front of the jury as a defense. So, and as you may know, I have testified as an expert and been qualified, accepted, and testified in 13 states, including United States federal court. And one of my last cases was testifying against the cult leader, Eligio Bishop, who headed an online cult called Carbon Nation. And he had 35,000 followers on Twitter. He was ultimately convicted of unlawful imprisonment and rape. And he's now serving a life sentence without parole in the state of Georgia. A few months ago, I was in court testifying. So what they want in such a court proceeding is objective physical evidence. They want eyewitness testimony, and it must be corroborated. And so Bishop was found guilty because that evidence existed. He would brag about some of his conquests in videos that he would release online. So a lot of the evidence was provided by the defendant. I can remember at one point being cross-examined by his counsel, and he said, on what basis do you think that Eligio Bishop is some kind of god being worshipped by his followers? And I said, well, that was what he said in this video. I said that in the video, he said, I'm God. And so I took him at his word that was what he intended his followers to believe, and that is what he taught them. And that is why women that he abused would stay quiet, because they believed to turn against Bishop was to turn against God. And so they kept quiet until finally some of them decided to leave, and then they came forward, and it was their eyewitness experience being corroborated by multiple women that ultimately led to Bishop being convicted and sent to prison. So frequently the whistleblowers are ex-members who have left a particular cult, and they have the knowledge of where literally the bodies are buried. And I could, list a number of cults in which former members came forward and pointed out where graves were, where victims were buried and bodies were recovered. So that's what it takes to prove claims about cult abuse and criminality. And in the case of the satanic ritual abuse, really myths that were everywhere in the late 80s, They just were not supported by proper evidence.
Right, and I thank you, because that's absolutely what I believe. It is interesting here, though, in Utah, we still have people that are actually members of law enforcement that are using that to discredit other people that are running for political office. And it's just like, so this, every few years or every decade, the same type of thing kind of rears its ugly head, and that, you've heard a lot about that with the QAnon goings-ons, which I would like to talk about in a moment. But I want to ask you more, because I would love to hear about another case where physical evidence was found after a former member went to law enforcement.
Well, there was a case in Ohio where a man who was at one time a member of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. You know that the Mormon Church split after the death of Joseph Smith, and one faction followed Brigham Young and another faction followed Joseph Smith's son, and that became the Reorganized Church. And there was a man in Ohio who at one time led tours of a temple that was located in the state of Ohio, a historic Mormon temple. And he gathered a group of followers around him, and those followers believed that he was a prophet, that he became an object of worship. And at one point, some of his followers wanted to leave. They wanted to move on with their lives. And he suspected as much, and he killed them. And then he buried them in the floor of a barn in Ohio. And later, his followers came forward, and they told authorities that he had murdered this entire family, the mother, the father, and the children. And they said, "We can take you to where the bodies are buried." And the authorities uncovered the remains of this family, and the leader was then prosecuted for murder. Let me look, and I can tell you, I cannot remember his name just off the top of my head, but it was the temple in Kirtland, Ohio. And the leader, excuse me as I put on my reading glasses. The leader was, okay, hold on. I'm having trouble finding that. Hold on a minute. There we go. It was the Avery family that were killed by the leader, Jeffrey Lundgren.
Okay.
And it was his followers that led authorities to the remains of the Avery family, who he murdered. And Lundgren was sentenced to death, and he was executed many years later in the state of Ohio.
Thank you. Thanks for looking that up. I appreciate it.
My glasses and my face, but I couldn't remember it off the top of my head.
No, I thank you. That's fascinating. It's something I want to look into. I have to ask you, as coming forward as the member of a cult to law enforcement, I'm sure is a very, very frightening thing to do. How often have you heard that cases or people coming forward like that are not taken seriously or marginalized by law enforcement?
I think Keith Raniere is an example of that. For years and years, there were stories that I heard from former members, from families that were affected by NXIVM, the cult that Raniere led, that he was sexually abusing women, children, that he was engaged in sex trafficking, financial fraud, and it just went on and on. And I had heard that people had gone to authorities over and over again saying, "Will you please investigate this man?" And in fact, a local newspaper, the Albany Times Union, did a series in which I participated called The Secrets of Nexium, in which they interviewed a woman who was raped as a child by Keith Raniere. And nothing was done. The authorities in New York did not prosecute Keith Raniere. It wasn't until Sarah Edmondson came forward. She was one of the women that had been branded by Keith Raniere. And she came forward and literally showed her scar to the New York Times. And she was then on the front page of the New York Times. And then the federal prosecutors in New York City, decided to take the case and prosecute Keith Raniere. So there were years that former members would say that he was committing crimes and nothing was done. And then finally, because of Sarah Edmondson coming forward and things kind of reaching a critical juncture, where also the actor Catherine Oxenberg, who had been famous, she was famous for her role in the popular television series Dynasty. Her daughter, India Oxenberg, who I work with, and also, of course, I work with Catherine Oxenberg, she put great pressure on the media, on the authorities to do something about Keith Raniere. And I think it was a combination of Mark Vicente leaving the group, of Sarah Edmondson showing her mutilation to the press, and Catherine Oxenberg working assiduously behind the scenes, that Keith Raniere finally came to justice. And I don't want to forget Tony Natale, who was Keith Raniere's old girlfriend that he had harassed and hounded. He even had a member kill her dog. There wasn't anything he wouldn't do to hurt Tony Natale. And Tony Natale had come forward for years and years saying, please do something, investigate this man. He's a criminal. He is a cult leader. And the authorities in upstate New York did nothing. In fact, at one point, they actually tried to arrest and prosecute Tony Natale over false charges that Keith Raniere had trumped up to go after her. And Tony Natale was exonerated, and they dismissed all of that. But she was an example of somebody who came forward, had been involved with Raniere, had firsthand information, and authorities ignored her in large part. And it wasn't until much later, after Raniere had hurt many more people, that the authorities finally prosecuted him successfully.
And why do you think that is? Is it because certain people in law enforcement would look at somebody that was in a cult and marginalize them, or think, well, they've joined a cult, so they deserve it? Or do they? I mean, what's going on there?
I think, Erica, you've nailed it. They marginalize people that are in cults. They say, well, you're probably one of these crazy cult people, and you wanted him to hurt you. You let him hurt you. So shame on you. And so it's like they re-victimize and re-traumatize the cult victim, the person who's already been hurt horribly by the cult leader. The authorities, by the way they may treat that person that comes forward, they increase their trauma, they increase their shame. And what we need to do is put the blame and the shame where it belongs, on the predator, the cult leader who has hurt people, not on the people that have been hurt by the cult leader. That they have been conned, they've been manipulated, they've been gaslit, they have been victimized. It is not their fault. But I think authorities frequently feel, well, so what? And they do marginalize the people that come forward, or they feel that because the group makes some religious claim, because many cults say that they're a religion, either because they believe that or because they want tax exempt status and special protection, or both. And I think that the authorities are reluctant to go after a religious organization.
And when you say these things, it just makes my skin crawl, because you can see the very same thing take place with people that are victims of domestic violence. With when they turn to authorities, the authorities marginalize what they've experienced, and then as a result re-traumatize the victim. And I think that is really, you would think in this day and age that these things would be we would be a little bit ahead of the game with regard to how we're educating, law enforcement on all of these things. Have you ever, and I'm sure you have, but can you give us an example of a cult that was working with and had protection of law enforcement?
I wouldn't go so far as to say they had protection of law enforcement. And I'm going to say something that some of your listeners may not agree with, but the group Falun Gong, which is led by a man they call Master Li, Li Hongzhi, and he is an exile from mainland China. He started the group Falun Gong, which is also called Falun Dafa, in China. There were millions of people in China that followed him. But there were many claims that he hurt people because he taught that they could meditate away physical ailments. And the Chinese authorities claim that many people died as a result of medical neglect. And in my own experience, I have worked with people that were involved with Falun Gong who thought that their asthma could be cured by meditation, and they stopped using an inhaler. Or in one intervention I did, a man with diabetes almost died because he believed he could meditate away his need for insulin. And I did an intervention, and he began to use his insulin again. And he's alive today. So I think that Falun Gong is an organization that has claimed that they've been persecuted, they've been defended by authorities, they've been defended by any number of political leaders because they control a newspaper called the Epoch Times. They also control a cable news network called New Tang Dynasty Television. And many people may know them from the Shen Yun Dance Company, which is this incredible, huge dance company that makes millions and millions of dollars a year, that travels around the US and around the world, staging these dance concerts where they have an orchestra, a large group of dancers doing what they call traditional Chinese dancing and performances. Recently, the New York Times exposed the fact that many of these dancers have been injured and they're not properly cared for, according to an article in the Times. And also, reportedly, they're not well paid or compensated. I also have received complaints from families that have children that are in this compound on Long Island in the area of Deer Park, New York, that haven't seen their children for long periods of time, are worried about the treatment of their children who are adults but are living in Deer Park, some of whom are involved with Shen Yun. So I think that's an organization that has been protected quite a bit. And whenever anyone questions the treatment of the dancers or the problems that families claim they're having with Falun Gong, the leadership, Master Li and his family, say, well, that's just persecution. You're persecuting us. That's the Communist Party trying to get us from China. And they play upon sympathies that we have as an American, in which we would say, well, the regime in China is totalitarian. They are an authoritarian regime. They do not have the same human rights record as other countries. And so maybe Falun Gong is being persecuted. And of course, Falun Gong will agree that they were wrongfully persecuted. But I would say that the people who are complaining on Long Island and are saying they're violating environmental standards, they're violating building permit requirements, zoning standards, that isn't persecution. That's just expecting them to follow the law and like everyone else. So again, it's not about what the group believes, it's about how they behave. And Falun Gong seems to think that any time that they are criticized, they can throw up the defense of, I'm being persecuted, and authorities will defend them and they will not be held accountable.
Very interesting way to play it there. I guess that seems to work for them. And you bring up something that in my mind that I think would be an interesting question.
I have
That's so cute.
problem there.
What's your problem's name?
Peanut.
Oh, cute.
Peanut the Chihuahua.
I have two Chihuahuas. Yeah. Two rescue Chihuahuas, and they're a handful. They are so spicy, but I love them.
Can you put me on pause for a moment?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. I'll be right
absolutely. Back. So anyway, guys, I will take a moment just to again thank all of you for hanging out with me on a weekday. I know that we're doing shows a little bit differently now that we're getting guests like this in, and so I'm just really excited that all of you are supporting the show and watching. Please make sure that you like the show, subscribe to it, please, and then hit the like button. And again, go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to check out our work and to become a Patreon. So he's back. Peanut is behaving now.
Peanut is behaving. Peanut is a ferocious 6-pound Chihuahua that guards my door. And when someone rings the door, even if it's a nice person, Peanut feels he must protect me.
Good for Peanut.
I don't think he thinks they're a cult leader or they're from Scientology, but nevertheless, he barks a warning.
Well, good. It's nice to have backup like that, for sure. So I wanted to ask you, because you kind of brought up a question in my mind, how many cult leaders, how many groups actually fund political campaigns?
Well, there have been times that groups have given large donations to political leaders. For example, Bill Clinton. Back in the day when Bill Clinton was mired in litigation, a woman by the name of her name in the group is Suma Qinghai. She's originally from Vietnam. She lives primarily, I think, in the US, has many thousands of followers, and leads this group as Supreme Master Suma Qinghai. She gave $500,000 in a single check contribution to Bill Clinton for his defense fund, I think, or something like that. And when he found out who she was, he gave the money back. And Reverend Moon, in his heyday, would ask people to do speaking engagements for various venues for the Unification Church. Ronald Reagan did a speech in Japan in which he received millions of dollars as an honorarium. George H.W. Bush would do speaking engagements. Gerald Ford did speaking engagements. Reverend Moon kind of liked Republicans. Master Suma Qinghai likes Democrats, apparently. But what they both understood, whether it be Reverend Moon or Suma Qinghai, is that if you give contributions, you have access, you have influence, or if nothing else, you can have a really good photo op with a leader who's well recognized and respected, which imbues you with the aura of respectability and authority. So this kind of activity has been done by cult leaders, and I would say that Falun Gong, Master Lee, through his control of the Epoch Times, which, by the way, one of the executives of the Epoch Times is now being prosecuted for money laundering, according to news reports. That entity, the Epoch Times, has been vociferously pro-Trump. And I think that Master Lee, like others before him, like Reverend Moon, feels that by supporting a political leader, he can engender uh, access, influence, and raise his own profile.
That is so interesting. There's so many connections to look at, and I know that Jay-Z Knight also contributed to both Republicans and the Democratic Party over the years, and so it is fascinating. And she also, interestingly enough, was a big contributor to the world's largest UFO organization. Well, it shouldn't surprise any of us on that one, but
Erica, let me just give you a footnote on Jay-Z Knight. She hosted Robert Kennedy Jr. as a speaker at her compound. And Robert Kennedy was told, you're going to speak in a cult compound. And he actually joked about it. He said, "Oh, they say you're a cult." And he didn't cancel his speaking engagement, which I'm sure he received a hefty honorarium. So Jay-Z Knight has worked that as well with Robert Kennedy Jr.
again, I don't know why I should be surprised about that. He's done so many interesting things like that, but thank you for letting us know about that. And that brings me to QAnon. What are your thoughts on QAnon, and how destructive is QAnon? Is it a cult?
In my opinion, QAnon is a destructive cult, but it's a very unusual one because the leader, who is the object of worship, Q, is anonymous. So we do not know who this leader actually is. There have been reports that speculate that the leader is this person or that person, but we really don't know. But in the way in which Q is always right, Q cannot be questioned, Q is the defining element and driving force of the movement, we see the familiar pattern of a destructive cult. And I have had many complaints about QAnon from families that feel that a loved one has been unduly influenced by the movement online and radicalized by their involvement online. So this is a group that I think is a very disturbing group that has caused an enormous amount of pain. And of course, there's one woman in Canada. I would have to look up her name, but she calls herself the QAnon Queen of Canada. And she literally leads her followers in RVs and trailers from place to place, and recently created quite a controversy in Saskatchewan by going to a very, relatively isolated, not densely populated area. And she kind of camped out in a former school and turned it into a kind of compound until local residents raised a lot of concern and she left. So in that sense, she led a faction within the QAnon movement, and she was their queen, their revelator, their absolute leader. And I would regard her, in my opinion, as a cult leader as well.
Thank you. It's been very interesting to watch Q, and like you said, there's not a specific person that is allegedly behind it. It could be a whole group of people that are behind this. It could be a foreign government. Who knows what is going on? It could be a whole host of different things. But I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime a group that people, the ideas have just spread, and like you say, you can't question the authority because nobody knows who the authority is. And when you get out of line, then that's, you're put into your place, and you're literally brainwashed. could there be something behind the scenes where you've got data brokers, people that are mining data, like we saw with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, the studies that were, take this personality quiz, and enter your information in here, people that are mining specific information, and then figuring out who is susceptible to this information, and then feeding that individual with things that instill a sense of fear or rage, and as a result leads them to potentially do things or ostracize themselves from their families or things like that. Do you think that that could be a part of it?
Well, that's the bread and butter of social media. I mean, basically, social media is predicated on algorithms. And so when you go to YouTube, and anyone that uses YouTube knows this, I know this. If I go to YouTube and I look at a restoration of a house online, the next time I go to YouTube, there'll be more of that served up towards the top of my YouTube page. So when people are bump into a conspiracy theory laden destructive cult, and they come in through some entry point about something the group teaches or believes, then if they go back to Facebook, or they go back to Twitter, or they go back to YouTube, the algorithm will then serve up more of the same, so that they continue to click through, continue to be involved. And that's the nature of the beast. That's the way that social media and online sites work with those algorithms. So once you begin your involvement, the more you continue to read, the more you continue to interact, the more that space online will serve up more of the same. And that is how many people that I've worked with in interventions first became involved with a destructive cult, was online. In fact, there's one group, Israelites United in Christ, that is headed up by a former police officer in the New York PD, who lives in the state of New York. And that website, that YouTube channel that he has, is the means by which he recruits and indoctrinates people. His name is Nathan Ray, and he recruits using YouTube. And I have dealt with him, testified in court against the group, which is a hate group. They believe, as Ray says, white people are devils. And they are a Black identity movement that claims that African Americans are the new Israel, the Jews are liars, and white people are devils. And I've helped a number of families that when one person becomes involved, one spouse, and the other spouse refuses, it leads to divorce and then a child custody battle, in which typically the spouse who is not involved in the group hires me to testify about the nature of the group and its history and what they teach children in an effort to protect their child from this man, Nathaniel Ray.
Wow. And so along those lines, I mean, that's the same way now that extremist movements, groups are recruiting people online as well, in different chat rooms and forums. And so it really is, it's quite staggering to know. And how do you think that we are getting a handle on this, and that we are sufficiently educating the public? Are we doing enough, in our country to educate people? I often say, what do we do? What are we teaching our kids in school? Is there a class on misinformation or cult education in our children's schools? And why aren't we doing that?
Erica, I would say the answer, what are we doing enough? No, we're not doing enough. And I would think that, and when you hear people describing a shooter as a lone wolf, that is an inappropriate and rather misleading label. People that are radicalized online, even if they're working alone, they are being radicalized by a group that is knowingly putting misinformation online and willfully radicalizing and indoctrinating people online. And it's kind of like the match being thrown into a pool of gasoline. It's fair to say that maybe the lone wolf is mentally unstable, may be paranoid, schizophrenic, bipolar, deeply depressed, manic. But the spark, the match that ignites that otherwise, uh, not uh, burning pool of gasoline is the group that is online, that is deliberately, radicalizing people and stimulating them to extremes. So I think we're not doing enough, and that the social media platforms, quite frankly, are not doing enough to police their platforms, in my opinion, to prevent this kind of thing. I mean, we live in a kind of a weird world that in many ways has become increasingly cult-like, in the sense that people feel that there are facts and then there are other facts. In other words, there is no real objective reality. Reality is what I say it is. I'm not bound by objective evidence. So I can make claims and then I can choose to cocoon myself online with other people who are like minded, who reinforce my worldview and my false statements. And then I can be in a kind of cult like alternate reality. And I find that very disturbing, that in because of the internet, because of social media, that people can say, well, I found that online. Online, it says the earth is flat. Online, it is known that we never landed on the moon. When in reality, these are false statements. But people can create a kind of alternate reality online where they're in a little bubble with other people that reinforce that belief or that claim, and they can, in a sense, inhabit this false reality. And in a sense, it's very much like living in a cult compound online.
It's so good, and I love what you said about lone shooters, because they are radicalized online. They're in a game room and they find a group of people, and you go down these rabbit holes, and that's exactly what is happening. And I think that that is something that needs to be talked about, and we are failing to do that. Law enforcement, our government officials, all of us are failing to do that. And I think that really is an important comment that you've made. I like that a lot. Do you think, and I got a question in chat, I have a question in chat, do you think MAGA is a cult?
No, no, I don't think Donald Trump is a cult leader and MAGA is not a cult. What, and I speak as someone who has been a registered Republican for many, many years. The Republican Party has evolved and changed. And many people that are Republicans are not happy about that. And many people that are Democrats or independents are not happy about that. But I think that since the civil rights movement, since the election of Richard Nixon, people that are concerned about integration, people that are concerned about immigration, people that are pro life, and people that have very specific views have created a kind of coalition in the Republican Party that has become preeminent and dominant. And these people have deeply held, sincerely held beliefs that they've had for their entire lives, and in many cases, generations, or in regional areas of the country. And so to dismiss MAGA people and say, oh, well, they just are brainwashed. What? These people have believed what they believe for a very long time. Donald Trump did not brainwash them. And Donald Trump is not a cult leader. He really is in fact someone who is running to be elected and who was elected and then lost in his bid for a second term the first time, and who has been held accountable in the courts and through our judicial system and through 2 impeachment proceedings. So unlike Reverend Moon, who was never held accountable by his followers, because they couldn't hold him accountable because there was no sense of laws and bylaws or a constitution in which members of the Unification Church could say, Reverend Moon, you broke our ethical guidelines, and or Reverend Moon, you need to run for election. Cult leaders don't run for election; they are dictators by definition. And so Donald Trump is someone who is being held accountable, has been held accountable, and ultimately is accountable to the voters. And the people that support him do not feel that they are being hurt by him. In fact, I think they genuinely feel happy with what he's done in overturning Roe v. Wade and other things that he's done. And I may disagree with much of what they believe, and other people may disagree with much of what they believe, but we should not call them a cult because it doesn't fit the definition of an absolute authoritarian leader without any meaningful accountability that becomes an object of worship, that is the defining element and driving force of the group. Second, that leader knowingly uses thought reform, coercive persuasion, and influence techniques to gain control over the critical thinking, decision-making, value judgments of their followers, and that those followers have been radically changed by that process. So families will tell me, my son, my daughter was a liberal, but now they're a radical conservative because the leader of their cult says this is the only way you can be, whether it's Reverend Moon or whether it's Master Lee of Falun Gong. So then you have the destructive nature of the group, which is that the leader exploits the members, takes advantage of the members, and is destructive to their life. I don't think that MAGA people feel that Donald Trump has been destructive. Rather, I think that they feel that his message is what they believe in, and his changing of the Supreme Court and other proposed changes that he wishes to make are what they themselves want as well. So, I mean, I think we need to step back and not use the word cult in a way that is not consistent historically with its true meaning and definition. And that goes for people on the right who say that Kamala Harris is a cult leader, or have said Bernie Sanders is a cult leader, or that the woke movement is a cult. No, the woke movement does not have a single authoritarian leader that is an object of worship. I've also heard the transgender movement being called a cult. So we need to be very careful that we're not using the word cult as an invective to dismiss people that we don't agree with, and imply that they're not thinking, that their opinions are not reasoned. In fact, they may very much disagree with us and represent something we don't agree with and we resent. And all we can do is go and vote rather than label them inaccurately as a cult and their leader that is running for election as somehow being an authoritarian cult leader.
And thank you. Those are very interesting thoughts, because you always hear that Donald Trump and MAGA he's a cult leader, and certainly I would question when you've got somebody that is portraying himself as Jesus, God. He is just some of the imagery that he puts forward, watching people at the RNC with the patches on their ears, and those, to me, those seem like things that are it would be prime kind of occult behavior
Well,
within Project 2025, trying to strip
but
away the rules of law where some of those things are, to me, kind of concerning. So I'm glad that you.
but Erica, I just would like to interject a couple
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
When Donald Trump was doing a speaking tour with Bill O'Reilly, another conservative, and they appeared in the red state of Alabama. And Donald Trump started talking about Operation Warp Speed, where they developed the Moderna vaccine. And he said, "I've been vaccinated." And Bill O'Reilly said, "Me too. And I hope everybody here has been vaccinated." People started to boo him, and they booed loudly. And Donald Trump backtracked and he walked it back, and he said, "I'm against mandates. I'm against forcing people to wear masks." And the crowd gradually stopped booing and started cheering. Cult leaders don't do that.
Okay.
Cult members didn't boo Reverend Moon. They didn't boo Keith Raniere. In fact, if they did, they would be shown the door, and that would be the end of them. That would not be tolerated. So the fact that Donald Trump was booed by MAGA members, and that they could exhibit that kind of behavior is a contradiction compared to cult followers that we would see in a typical destructive cult. Another thing is the leader does not recalibrate and redo his position vis-a-vis his followers. Rather, he expects his followers to redo their beliefs to be consistent with whatever he or she says. And another example of that is Donald Trump going back and forth over the abortion amendment that is now being proposed and voted on in the state of Florida. And him saying, "I'm for IVF. I'm for IVF. Every woman should get IVF for free, or it should be paid for by our insurance." Those are not the sentiments of many of his followers within the MAGA movement. And many of them have said, "I don't agree with him. And how dare he say that? How dare he say that he might vote for an amendment to change the way abortion is being handled in the state of Florida?" So that is not the way cult members respond to a cult leader.
Okay.
So when you see that kind of back and forth, and you see the leader changing his message to placate or make nice with his supporters, that's a politician, to be sure, but that is not the behavior of a dictatorial cult leader.
Okay, thank you. That's very, very interesting. And yeah, that gives me lots to think about. Absolutely. So, and all of us, I know that has got chat going. So definitely, thank you very much. I want to talk a little bit, of course, but I want to just talk a little bit before we go about your lovely book. And I love the cover, by the way.
Thank you.
It's very cool, very clean. So give us the rundown on your book and where we can get it and all of the good things, how people can follow your work.
The book is available through Amazon. So you go to Amazon.com, and Cults Inside Out is available in Audible. It's available as a Kindle download, and it's also available in paperback. And what you will find is a compendium of historical and research information about cults that begins with the modern history of cults, starting with Charlie Manson and taking it all the way current to Keith Raniere. In fact, Cults Inside Out was the first book to identify Keith Raniere as a cult, as someone that could be considered a cult leader. It was the first book about cults that included NXIVM. Also, it's a book that contains chapters on intervention, how that works, case examples, and it has a chapter on recovery. It also has a chapter on abusive controlling relationships. about 1/3 of American women have in some way been affected by an abusive, controlling relationship. And the men typically who are involved fit the narcissistic profile of many cult leaders. And, and, and in a sense, an abusive, controlling relationship, which has at times been called a cultic relationship, by some researchers, which I mention in the book, is analogous to being in a cult, because you have one absolute totalitarian leader, the abusive partner, and then you have the victim who is being gaslit, who's being manipulated, who's frequently isolated from family and friends in a controlled environment, and who's being terrorized by the abusive, controlling partner, being told, if you leave, terrible things will happen to you. You'll never be loved like you're being loved by me. You can't trust your friends or family, but you can trust me. And so in a sense, it's like being in a cult. And so I have a chapter about what to look for in an abusive, controlling relationship, to identify it and identify an abuser. And then I also have a chapter about an intervention that I did. I've done many to get typically young women out of abusive, controlling relationships. So the book really is quite expansive. There are more than 1,200 research footnotes and an 18-page bibliography. So it's really almost like a textbook about the subject of cults and cult control. And I hope people will look into it.
I know that I'm going to be getting it today because you've just said some things that have blown my mind, especially, about the abusive relationships and the type of people that are involved in harming people, whether they be a cult leader or an abusive partner. I mean, these are things that everyone should read. Everybody should know, have this information. In fact, I'll order a copy for my friends and family because this is important stuff. And I can't thank you enough for your work. You have really, every time I've watched you lecture or seen you in an interview, you have struck a chord with me. And your work, in my opinion, everybody needs to be aware of this, especially as we move through this digital age of misinformation and disinformation, and we start to see more and more what AI is capable of in the way of steering us down rabbit holes. How do we make sure that we're protected? And I really appreciate your work and your time with me. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And I will leave footnotes and information on where to get your book. And I will be, after I get it, and I would love to have you back if you are willing. I know your schedule is really quite busy, but there's so many topics that we could talk about. And I know that we would have a great conversation. So hopefully sometime you would be willing to come back.
I certainly would. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon and a great rest of your week, which is very short because today's Thursday, but have a nice weekend.
All right.
Thank you. That was a wonderful interview. I'm going to watch that again. I want to thank all of you for joining me. You can go to Expanding Frontiers Research to check out our work. And again, like I said, I will be posting footnotes of where you can find Rick's wonderful book and read more about his work that he has done over the years. Thanks all of you guys for joining me. I also want to say the next couple of weeks are going to be very busy because I am interviewing three more people. I've got 3 interviews coming up, and I will be posting those very quickly. I want to thank again all of you for being here, Jack, and all of your wonderful, again, you guys asked the best questions. Amy, it's nice to see you. Give Dinah a big hug for me. Stephanie, good to see you again. And thanks you guys for everything. Thanks, Jack, for being a great partner. And like I said, expandingfrontiersresearch.org. If you want to become a Patreon, make sure you click like and subscribe. You guys take care. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will catch you soon.